Hello, I'm Larry Wilson. I'd like to welcome you to this segment in our seminar series. Today we're going to begin with part 1 in our study on great clocks from God. The ways of God are always deliberate, purposeful, intentional. The ways of God are always in complete harmony with His actions throughout an entire eternity. Because God knows the end from the beginning, because God has perfect foreknowledge both of the past, the present, and the future, because God is ever consistent and without change, He never has to change the rules. God never has to make adjustments for lack of wisdom, as human beings do. Because God stands in the future as well as in the past and in the present simultaneously, God's behavior and God's ways are the one constant thing that we can depend on throughout all the ages. I, the Lord, He says, do not change. Now, because God doesn't change, and because God is consistent, and because God has foreknowledge, God does things today that may appear very mysterious and strange, but 10 years from now, or 10,000 years from now, the beauty of what He did finally comes to light. And we see and understand and marvel at how great it is that we have a God who is a God of love, and yet everything He does for the benefit of His children. Let me take you to the computer screen. I want to read a few statements as we begin this study on great clocks from God. God has foreknowledge. This means He knows everything there is to know about the future. For example, when God created the world, He foreknew everything that would be needed at the time of creation to accomplish His objectives. You might say God is a lot like a cook who has a recipe, and the cook wants to produce what the recipe will ultimately create. And so if the cook follows the recipe, the end result should be with what the recipe has predicted. Because God foreknows the timing and duration of every event, this is critical, because God foreknows the timing and duration of every event, God created the phenomenon we call time. God created this phenomenon of time, and He did this on the first day of the week. What is time? Time, by definition, is the duration between two events. So if you say that you are 3 years old, you are measuring the duration of your life. If you are saying, I'm going on vacation next week, you are measuring the duration between now and the time you depart on vacation. So time is basically the duration between two events. As we shall see, time on earth is measured in several ways. God has given man 7 and perhaps 8 great clocks so that we might measure and understand the duration of His plans. God has given man 7, perhaps 8. We're going to see in this study what you think about whether there are 7 or 8 great clocks so that we might measure and understand the duration of His plans. It is my purpose in these next few studies to demonstrate some of the marvelous wisdom of God. The topic of time and timing is truly a marvelous thing to behold, and the more we understand God's ways, the better we can appreciate God. Now, God has placed 18 prophetic time periods in Daniel and Revelation. This may come to you as a complete surprise. In the books of Daniel and Revelation, there are 18 time periods. Some of them are given in terms of days, like the 1335 days of Daniel chapter 12, or the 1260 days in Revelation 11, or the 70 weeks in Daniel chapter 9, or the 1,000 years in Revelation 20, or the times in half a time found in Daniel 7 and in Revelation chapter 11. We might find 1,242 months in Revelation 13. My point is that God has put several time periods all around in the prophetic books. And the big question is, why did He do that? Why did He do that? Well, I think there's a simple answer. God has given us a number of clues. The whole idea of Bible prophecy is that God gives us a very direct clue as to what His plans are, and what He intends to do, and how He intends to go about it. So I understand the 18 time periods given in Daniel and Revelation to all come together like a puzzle, revealing what the big plan really is. Let's go back to the screen. Contrary to the claims of most clergy, these time periods are important. Most preachers will tell you they're meaningless. And they say that because to them they are meaningless. But they are very important if you want to understand God's plans and God's ways. We're going to examine these time periods and notice their contribution to a very big puzzle. That puzzle is the mystery of God's timetable. Do you believe that the coming of the Lord is near? Do you believe that Jesus is coming soon? On what basis do you say that? Nations have come and gone. Civilizations have risen and fallen and disappeared. There have been wars and rumors of wars, and Jesus says in Matthew 24, don't be distressed by wars and rumors of wars. Those things have got to happen. They've got to take place, so don't concern yourself. Those aren't signs of the end. Where is the end? Most Christians today scoff at any kind of discussion on the timing of the return of Jesus. And there's one favorite verse that everyone loves to quote in Matthew 24, that no one knows their day or the hour. Well, I heard an old Baptist preacher several years ago say that he knew the day and the hour of the Lord's return. He not only knew the day and the hour, he knew the year, he said. And of course, he had the full attention of his audience. And then he said, I'm going to tell you when the Lord is coming. He said, it's at an hour you think not. It's true, no one knows on the calendar what day or year or month or week when Jesus will return. That's a statement that can't be controverted. However, we can know the season. By that I mean we can know the general window of time during which it will occur. Now that's a pretty bold statement, I understand, but I believe with all my heart that we are living in that window of time. And I'm going to try to demonstrate that to you and show you why I have that conclusion. Let's go back to the screen. It appears to me, and I'm making this subjective, that God, from the very beginning, allotted 7,000 years for the existence of sin. I believe that God knew, because He foreknew that sin was going to happen, that He allotted from the very beginning 7,000 years for the existence of sin. Now, God used the weekly template upon which to create this understanding that I'm going to present and share with you. Let me show you what I mean by a weekly template. God created at creation a week of 7 days. Years later, when the children of Israel were delivered out of Egypt, He created a week of weeks. He created a week of months. He created a week of years. He created 7 weeks of years. I believe He created 7 great weeks and 1 grand week. Now, I'm going to take you to my drawing pad here for a second. I want to try to show you how this works. See what you think. I'm going to show you that I believe that when God created the earth, He laid out a really neat calendar. Now, my drawing here leaves a lot to be desired, but you'll get the idea shortly. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And when God created the 7th day, He set it apart and made it holy from all the other days of the week. Now, we call these days of the week by Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and then Sabbath or Saturday. Now, when God created the earth, and He did so in these 7 days, and He set the 7th day aside, this becomes a template that God will use in other timing schemes. And what I would like to suggest to you is that if we make each one of these days of the week represent other time periods, we find that God, and He does this, makes a very neat matrix of events. For example, when the children of Israel came out of the land of Egypt, God required them to set up a Sabbath for the land. Now, let me just back up for a minute here, and I'm going to put down here, when God created the 7th day, He created the Sabbath for man. Okay? We know this from Mark chapter 2, where Jesus said the Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath. So when God created the 7th day Sabbath, at the time of creation, He made it for man. Years later, when the children of Israel were delivered from their bondage of slavery in Egypt, when God put them in the promised land, He said, you count off every 7th year, and the land itself is to observe a Sabbath rest. Let me see if I can put that text on the screen for you real quick here so that you can see what I'm talking about. Let's go to the computer screen. The Lord said to Moses on Mount Sinai, speak to the Israelites and say to them, when you enter the land I'm going to give you, the land itself must observe a Sabbath to the Lord. A Sabbath to the Lord. For 6 years, sow your fields, and for 6 years prune your vineyards and gather their crops. But in the 7th year, the land is to have a Sabbath of rest, a Sabbath to the Lord. Do not sow your fields or prune your vineyards. Do not reap what grows of itself, or harvest the grapes of your untended vines. The land is to have a year of rest. Well, let's go back now to my little chart, and I'm trying to show that what God did at creation, in creating the weekly cycle of 7 days and the template of 7 days and rest for man, that he then, when he put his people in the promised land, he required a 7th year sabbatical. He made the 7th year holy, and every 7th year the land was to rest and to have a Sabbath to the Lord. And the Lord promised Israel, I'm going to take this purple here because I want to kind of highlight, hope you can see this on your screens all right. This purple means that in the 6th year, God would give a bumper crop. I'll write bumper there. The idea here is that during the 6th year, because the land was going to lay fallow, God would give a very, very special harvest for the sake that there would be enough food for his people to have a year of rest. The land would rest. It's an agricultural nation, living from hand to mouth, literally. And God is saying, I want the land to rest, and to show you that this is what I want, I'm going to give you a bumper crop in the 6th year. Now notice that this is not for the benefit of the land. This has nothing to do with agriculture. This is not an agricultural exercise. This is a faith exercise to see if man will do what God has required. Because it's not agricultural, because we know that the 6th year would be the weakest year for the soil. The 6th year would be the exhausted state of the soil. But in fact, the 6th year produces the bumper crop so that there's food enough for man to rest. God is ever interested in testing us to see if we will obey him, if we will observe his commandments or not. In fact, let me take you to another scripture here in Exodus chapter 16, and I'll show you this verse here in just a second. In Exodus 16, the Lord, let's go to the computer screen. The whole Israelite community set out from Elim and came to the desert of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai, and on the 15th day of the 2nd month, after they had come out of Egypt. In the desert, the whole community grumbled against Moses and Aaron. The Israelites said to them, Moses and Aaron, "Oh, if only we had died by the Lord's hand in Egypt. There we sat around pots of meat and ate all the food we wanted, but you have brought us out into this desert to starve this entire assembly to death." So the people were already complaining. Then the Lord said to Moses, "I will rain down bread from heaven for you. The people are to go out each day and gather enough for that day." That day. In this, I will test them and see whether they will follow my instructions. What is God going to do? What's the purpose here? I'm going to test them. On the 6th day, they are to prepare what they bring in, and that is to be twice as much as they gather on the other days. So Moses and Aaron said to all the Israelites, "In the evening you will know that it was the Lord who brought you out of Egypt. And in the morning you will see the glory of the Lord, because he has heard your grumbling against him. Who are we that you should grumble against us?" See, they're deflecting the criticism because they didn't deliver them from Egypt. It was the Lord. Moses also said, "You will know that it was the Lord when he gives you meat to eat in the evening and all the bread you want in the morning, because he has heard your grumbling against him." Who are we? You're not grumbling against us, but against the Lord. So Moses told Aaron, say to the entire Israelite community, come before the Lord, for he has heard your grumbling. And while Aaron was speaking to the whole Israelite community, they looked toward the desert, and there was the glory of the Lord appearing in the cloud. The Lord said to Moses, I have heard the grumbling of the Israelites. Tell them at twilight you will eat meat, and in the morning you will be filled with bread, and then you will know that I am, the great I am, the Lord your God. Well, that evening, quail came and covered the camp, and in the morning there was a layer of dew around the camp. When the dew was gone, thin flakes like frosted flakes, Kellogg's Frosted Flakes. I'm sure that's what this was. Thin flakes like frost on the ground appeared on the desert floor. When the Israelites saw it, they said to each other, what is it? For they did not know what it was. And Moses said to them, it is the bread the Lord has given you to eat. It is the bread. The word manna means, what is it? This is what the Lord has commanded. Each one is to gather as much as he needs. So take an omer for each person you have in your tent. An omer is about a quart. The Israelites did as they were told. Some gathered much, some little. And when they measured it by the omer, he who gathered much did not have too much, and he who gathered little did not have too little. Each one gathered as much as he needed. Now Moses said to them, no one is to keep any of it until morning. However, there are always some wise guys in the crowd. Some of them paid no attention to Moses. They kept part of it until the morning, but it was full of maggots and began to smell. So Moses was angry with them. Each morning everyone gathered as much as he needed, and when the sun grew hot, it melted away. On the 6th day, they gathered twice as much, 2 omers for each person, and the leaders of the community came and reported this to Moses. He said to them, this is what the Lord commanded. Tomorrow is to be a day of rest, a holy Sabbath to the Lord. So bake what you will want to bake, and boil what you want to boil. Save whatever is left, and keep it until morning. So they saved it until morning, as Moses commanded, and it did not stink or get maggots in it. Now that's an interesting thing. For 40 years, this goes on. On the 7th day, manna doesn't stink or get maggots in it if you try to keep it over. Eat it today, Moses said, because today is a Sabbath to the Lord. You will not find any of it on the ground today. 6 days you are to gather it, but on the 7th day, the Sabbath, there will not be any. Nevertheless, some of the hardheads went out on the 7th day to gather it, but they found none. And then the Lord said to Moses, how long will you refuse to keep my commands and my instructions? The point that I'm leading up to is that when God created the 7th day Sabbath at creation, he had a reason. Because of his foreknowledge, because of what he knew was coming, because of the recipe he had from the very beginning, he knows what he's got in mind as a demonstration. And he's going to use the weekly cycle to build our understanding of what that plan is. The weekly cycle is a template of God's plans for earth. The weekly cycle is a unit of timing. And this timing, I believe, carries over in many different areas. Let's go back to the drawing board for a second, and let me show you something else. So at creation, we have the 7 days. At creation in Genesis chapter 2, verses 1 through 3, the 7th day was made and declared holy and set apart. At the time of the Exodus, before there is the 10 Commandments even, God requires Israel to gather manna 6 days a week. And there's a bumper crop of manna on every Friday so that there will be no manna on the Sabbath. And he does this to test their faith. And then when we read in Leviticus 25, when they enter the promised land, they are to observe a sabbatical. The land is. Every seventh year, the land is to lay fallow. And God has said, I'm going to provide enough harvest in the sixth year. You won't have to worry about the seventh. So God is giving us here a template. We see it at creation. We see it with the manna. We see this same template with the land. And I'm going to suggest to you that in our next segment of our seminar here, that this weekly template represents, each one of these represent 1,000 years. So that each day of the week represents 1,000 years. And this is why we find in Revelation chapter 20 a sabbatical millennium of 1,000 years in which the saints are reigning with Christ. In other words, what I want to say to you is that a day with the Lord is as 1,000 years. That's right. A day with the Lord is as 1,000 years. And the weekly cycle, the weekly template, this 1,000 years suggests the presence of other units of 1,000 years. And in fact, here's the amazing thing. Let me move my chart just a little bit. Here's an amazing thing. Let me choose this green ink pen. When you take, and we're going to go through this in our next chart, in our next segment, when you take the time from Noah down to the flood, and which is about 1,660 years, and then you go from the flood down to the time of the Exodus, which is a period of about 989 years, and then when you go from the Exodus down to the time of 1994, so that you get 70 cycles of Jubilee weeks in here. And then when you add in the prophetic time periods that necessarily remain to be fulfilled before Jesus can appear, and when you add in the 1,000 years of the sabbatical millennium, when you add that all together, the Bible in its entirety only speaks of 7,000 years. The Bible in its entirety only speaks of 7,000 years. Well, we're out of time. Wouldn't you know it? In our next segment, I'm going to examine this more carefully and try to show you how it all adds up. So please stay tuned, and we'll see you in our next study. May God bless you, is my prayer.